And welcome. Welcome to the Berkley Center. My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm especially delighted to welcome you to this launch of the 2011 American Values Survey. Robert Jones and his colleagues from the Public Religion Research Institute are releasing their latest findings outlining how religion and values are shaping American attitudes toward the economy, toward the Republican field, toward the Obama presidency. Now, every year the Institute survey makes news, and as you're about to hear, the findings this year are particularly interesting and newsworthy. We've got an economic crisis. We've got two Mormon candidates. We've got the Tea Party movement. We've got the Occupy Wall Street movement. We've got that host of culture wars issues we're so familiar with. But I think for me, and I hope this will come out in the conversation, most interesting is how issues of values and ethics and identity and religion are intersecting with the economic crisis and people's concerns, people's approaches to that crisis, and how it might be resolved in the election a year from today, but also more generally. So this is how we're going to proceed. After Robbie comes up and presents the report and its main findings, we'll have an opportunity for a discussion here at the table up front that I'll moderate with my colleague Jose Casanova from the Center, with Melissa Deckman of Washington College. We'll try to highlight and discuss some of the most interesting findings and their significance, but leave ample time to open things up to you for a broader discussion. So again, thanks for coming, and with that I want to hand it over to Robbie.
All right, lower the microphone. All right. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for being here today. It's 1 year out to the day from the election next year, and so we have some insights to provide a little snapshot of where the American public is today. As Tom mentioned on what we're calling the Mormon question, with two Mormon candidates in the GOP primary on economic inequality. So we've been in an economic crisis for some time, but of late, the issues of economic inequality and equal opportunity have come to the fore with the Occupy Wall Street movement and been raised by the Tea Party movement in some different ways as well. And then finally, the 2012 presidential campaign and attitudes toward the Obama presidency at this kind of critical stage heading into the final run into 2012. So those are kind of the main three areas we're going to be covering. Just have a couple of words before we get started. Now we have some people on the phone. The actual survey data, the report, the top line questionnaire, all of that is available at our website at publicreligion.org/research. It's also right there on the homepage if you just go to publicreligion.org. So it's all there. You can download the report, download the top lines. And also want to just thank again the Berkley Center here at Georgetown University for this fabulous space and venue this morning. And also just a personal thanks to Melissa Deckman and Jose Casanova. Melissa from Washington College, Jose Casanova here from the Berkley Center for their expertise and what I'm sure will be great insights added to the conversation once we sort of move into that phase of it. Just a couple more words of thanks. I want to thank Public Religion Research Institute's Research Director, Daniel Cox, who's here with us in the second row today, who was a full co-author of the report and helped analyze all the data top to bottom. So thanks, Dan, for all your hard work. And also, last but certainly not least, I want to thank the Ford Foundation and the Nathan Cummings Foundation, without whom this research would not have been possible today. So let's jump right in. The three areas we'll be covering, as I said, is the Mormon question, the 2012 election, evaluations of the Obama presidency, and these questions of equal opportunity and economic inequality, and as Tom mentioned, in particular, how religion and values really impact these attitudes on these questions. There's some really interesting patterns when we get to that section that have emerged in this study. So first, the Mormon question in 2012 election, and particularly front-runner Mitt Romney's challenge among a key group in the Republican primary, that is white evangelical Protestant Christians. So first of all, just a couple of kind of big picture numbers here to set the table. We asked this question a couple times this year, and we found very consistent findings that 2/3 of Americans say that it is important for a presidential candidate to have strong religious beliefs. Despite the fact that the Constitution guarantees, no religious test for office, having strong religious beliefs in general is an attribute that voters are looking for in a president. That number, if you look at white evangelical Protestants, they are off the charts on this number. It's nearly unanimous. 93% of white evangelical Protestant Christians say that it's important for a presidential candidate to have strong religious beliefs. African American Protestants not far behind. 7 in 10 Catholics. 2/3 of white mainline, and even 1/3 of religiously unaffiliated Americans say that it's important for a president to have strong religious beliefs. And one number here is that we had a follow-up question on this where we said, okay, well, what if that candidate's beliefs are very different from your own? How does that affect it? Turns out that it does matter, right? It's not just any old religious beliefs, but religious beliefs that are somehow have some resonance with their own. So 19% of voters, for example, say, well, even if a president had strong religious beliefs, but if those beliefs were very different from my own, I would be less likely to vote for that candidate. So that's a finding. That number actually rises to 36% among white evangelical Protestant Christians. So there's one hint of kind of the challenge that Romney may face for white evangelical Protestant Christians. And we'll see a little bit more why as we move forward. A couple of questions that help us gauge how voters perceive the Mormon faith, really, not tied directly to the presidential context, but the question about, we had a controversy, Pastor Jeffords, an evangelical pastor out of Dallas, who, kind of infamously said that Mormonism was a cult at the Values Voters Conference, and that caused quite a stir. We saw it come back up again in some of the presidential debates. It turns out that only about 1/3 of voters think that the Mormon faith is not a Christian religion. However, again, among white evangelical Protestant Christians, that number goes to nearly half, 49%, who say that the Mormon faith is not a Christian religion. On a broader question about whether Mormons have religious beliefs that are very different or similar to their own, among all voters, say that Mormons have religious beliefs that are different from their own. That's 66%. And white evangelical voters are right there, really at the same. 68% of white evangelical voters say that Mormons have religious beliefs that are very different from their own. Now, why does this matter? If we run just a quick check on this number, for example, and we look at among voters who are familiar with Romney and who believe that Mormons have religious beliefs similar to their own, 2/3 of them have a favorable view of Romney. If we look at the flip side of that, voters who are familiar with Romney and who believe Mormons have religious beliefs different from their own, that number drops to the favorability number drops to 47%. Right, so there's nearly a 20-point drag on favorability linked to evaluations of whether the Mormon faith is similar or different from their own. So another question we asked to kind of just make sure we're getting a good read on this was a straight-up question about whether people would be comfortable or uncomfortable with a Mormon serving as president. Among all voters, 4 in 10 say they would either be somewhat or very uncomfortable with a Mormon serving as president. We look down under religions. We have African American Protestants at the highest, 6 in 10, saying that they would be at least somewhat uncomfortable. White evangelicals, again, that number rises to almost half at 47%, saying they would be somewhat uncomfortable with a Mormon serving as president. We also see some interesting age differences that we could talk about later. The millennial generation, the generation under 30, a majority, 54%, said they would be at least somewhat uncomfortable with a Mormon serving as president. If you look down at seniors, those age 65 or older, that's only 39%. So we see some really interesting generational differences. We could talk about those later. I'm going to actually end the presentation with some other generational differences that I think will be, kind of putting those together will be interesting for thinking about how younger people and the general election especially may shape what's going on. One thing we included in this survey was an interesting experiment that was designed to see whether people were telling us the truth, basically, about whether they had discomfort with a Mormon becoming president. These are telephone surveys, so as you might imagine, people might have, we were theorizing people might have some misgivings about telling a stranger over the telephone that they had some discomfort with a Mormon serving as president. So we included a way in the survey where they could tell us that indirectly without having to tell the interviewer that exactly. And basically what we did is we set up a list experiment that it said, we had 4 statements, and we said, tell us how many of these statements might make you uncomfortable, but don't tell us which one. And we split the survey sample in half. So half the sample only got 3 statements, half the sample got 4, with the 4th being discomfort with a Mormon serving as president. And then we were able to see people, whether they were giving us kind of accurate direct measures versus the indirect measure. The interesting thing about this is there was absolutely no difference in the indirect measures and the direct measures at the general population level. And that was true for virtually every demographic group we looked at, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, moderates, liberals, white evangelical Protestants. The one group that sticks out here is white mainline Protestants, where we had a direct measure of concern. Only 3 in 10 indicated that they had some discomfort with the Mormon serving as president, but 57% indicated indirectly that this would be something that would bother them. So we can talk about that again a little bit later and kind of try to unpack that a little bit. But it's a very interesting finding that the white mainline Protestants are the one group that stick out here, that there's a gap between a direct and indirect measure of discomfort with a Mormon becoming president. We have a couple of time series things here. We were in the field in July and September and October asking about knowledge of Romney's religion and favorability of Romney. One very intriguing thing, if we look among white evangelical Protestant voters, as a whole, astonishingly enough, most Americans today continue to not know that Mitt Romney's religion is Mormon. So we asked this in July. It was only 4 in 10. We asked it again in October. The number had barely moved. There's no statistical difference here. 42% still only know. So this is despite, 7 debates, a controversy around the Values Voters Summit, lots of press around this, and yet still only 4 in 10 know that Romney's religion is Mormon. The one group that we looked at, and this is virtually the only group for which this is true, where knowledge has gone up, is among white evangelical Protestants. Their knowledge went from 44% in July up to 53% in October. So that's a significant change among that group. Now, if you'll pay attention to this slide with the next one, you'll see, so this is July to October, knowledge about Romney's religion has gone up, and Romney's favorability has gone down. So this is actually over just the last months, from September to October. And in September, Romney's favorability among white evangelical voters was 63%. That number has dropped now down to 49%. So we can't make a cause and effect kind of conclusion here, but these two things are certainly happening at the same time. Knowledge of his religion is going up. Favorability is going down. There's also the rise of Herman Cain in this, which kind of complicates the picture here in this scenario as well. That's certainly some effect too. But so there's kind of rise of Herman Cain, rise in knowledge of Romney's faith as Mormon, and drop in favorability among white evangelical Protestants all at the same time. One thing that I think may provide a window into Herman Cain's rise, and we have a press conference this afternoon, right, which may change this equation completely. But up to now, one thing that may essentially, when we were in the field in September, Herman Cain was polling in single-digit numbers, right? He was just nowhere on the radar screen, and we went back in the field in October, and what we see here, and the picture you can see is, if you look at Herman Cain, he's on the left. And we had a question about which candidate is closest to your political views, which candidate is closest to your religious beliefs. And if you look at this combination, what you see is that Herman Cain has really been able to take advantage of some weaknesses among Mitt Romney on the religious side and Rick Perry on the political side, right? So Rick Perry is as strong as Cain on religious people saying that his religious beliefs are close to their own. This is among evangelical voters, but only almost like half as many say his political beliefs or political views are closest to their own. Among Mitt Romney has the opposite problem, right? That 21% say his political views of the evangelicals say his political views are closest to their own, but only 8% say his religious beliefs are closest to their own. Herman Cain does a little better than Romney and better than Romney on politics, and he does better than Perry on religious affinity. And this is at least one part of the explanation, I think, among white evangelical voters for why he's been able to sort of move ahead, because he's sort of gaining strength from Romney's kind of religious weakness and gaining strength from Perry's political weakness, particularly among white evangelical Protestant voters, which are such a key group in the Republican primaries. So we also had a great sort of set of questions about the Obama presidency. We want to get a read on kind of emotional read on where people thought, what their feelings were about the Obama presidency at this state, and also among people who have unfavorable views, why they have unfavorable views. So here's kind of the initial snapshot. If we look at favorability and job performance, let's take job performance first. The country's evenly split on evaluating President Obama's job as president. We have 45% approving, 44% disapproving. But if we look at favorability, as his personal favorability is actually a little stronger than that. He's 53% favorable, 44% unfavorable, right? So, and we'll see some of this as we kind of unpack some of the unfavorable views here. So we had a question that asked about whether Americans are excited, satisfied, disappointed, worried, or angry. We have about even numbers saying that they're excited or satisfied on the one hand. About a third of the country says this. A little bit more than that say they're either worried or angry. These obviously have strong partisan divides here, with Democrats kind of overpopulating the excited or satisfied, and the Republicans, overpopulating the worried or angry. But I think the real key wedge here is the disappointed wedge that you see in the middle. And that's also about a third, about 3 in 10 Americans say they're disappointed. And this is a real mix of people. This is people who voted for him. This is people who didn't vote for him. And we'll see in a minute that one of the things that people are saying is he promised to do things he hasn't delivered. There were promises made that he hasn't kept. It's that sentiment that is really driving this middle wedge of being disappointed in where the Obama presidency is at this stage. We asked an open-ended question of everyone who said they had an unfavorable or disapproved of his job as president. We asked an open-ended question and said, okay, well, tell us in your own words why you disapprove of Obama's performance as president. And we basically said, not surprisingly, 37%, about 4 in 10, cited something about the economy, his handling of the economy, not generating enough jobs, those kinds of things. We also had about 4 in 10, 41% citing leadership abilities. And this was about, and this is where some of that disappointment came in. He hasn't followed through with some thof the things he said he would do. And then personal ones, these are the ones that were pretty hardcore. He's a socialist, he's a Marxist, he doesn't sort of have American values and those kinds of things. And then 9% cited something else that was a whole grab bag of stuff having to do with like foreign policy and other things like that. But you can see the big thing, obviously the economy, but also this kind of big category of leadership. I have a couple of quotes here on the right from an independent, a millennial Democrat, a member of the Tea Party movement, to kind of give you the flavor of some of what we heard from these open-ended responses. We coded them a little more carefully, and this is in the report broken down. Just a couple I want to flag here. I don't want to go through everything here. But one that, the Obama presidency spent a lot of time on healthcare reform early on. One very interesting thing here, only 6% of these open-ended people cited healthcare reform as a reason they disapproved of Obama's job performance. Really didn't register, only among a very small number of folks. It really is other things, creating jobs. And if you look at the other one I want to flag is broken promises, 17%, right? That's almost 1 in 5 saying broken promises. That really ties in with that disappointment wedge that we see with the Obama presidency. So that's kind of a picture of kind of where things are with the Obama presidency. So divided on job performance, majority saying they still have a favorable view of the president, and then I'll say a little bit more about healthcare here at the end. But so turning to the third major set of findings, equal opportunity, economic inequality. We're really seeing some competing visions of what you might call the good society, right? What does a good society look like? What does a just society look like? And there are partisan differences here. There are generational differences here. So it's perhaps not surprising. There are also some really interesting places of consensus that I'm going to point to as well. So here's the first slide's a little busy, but this is about whether things are a critical issue in the country. And so what we see, if you look at the first two things, jobs and protecting Social Security, there's basically a kind of consensus around those two things. Like those are the two most important things that both Republicans, creating jobs, both Democrats and Republicans, there's no differences there. Protecting Social Security, Democrats are slightly ahead of Republicans, but still 6 in 10 Republicans say this is a critical issue. You start seeing some real differences and these are priorities, not support, but priorities on reducing the deficit, with Republicans, nearly 3/4 of Republicans saying this is a critical issue, only half of Democrats saying that. And as we look down the line here, increasing government support for people in poverty, majority of Democrats say that, only 23% of Republicans say that. Reducing the gap between the rich and the poor, 6 in 10 Democrats, only 22% of Republicans. And raising the minimum wage, 51% of Democrats, only 22% of Republicans. So you can really see, in terms of priorities here, some real partisan differences shaping up. And the priorities are actually sharper than the views on the policies, as we'll see in just a second. So one big picture question about equal opportunity. We had a either-or question that asked people to identify with a couple of statements which statement comes closest to your own view. One of the big, and here's the first statement, was one of the biggest problems in the country is that we don't give everyone an equal chance in life. The second one is it's not really that big a problem, as some people have more of a chance in life than others. Overall, a majority of Americans agree with the first statement, that it's one of the biggest problems in the country is that we don't give everyone an equal chance in life. Again, big partisan differences here. 7 in 10 Democrats agree with the first statement. And 54% of Republicans agree with the second statement, right? It's not really that big of a problem. And independents look about like the general public, with slightly more favoring the first statement, that it's a bigger problem, that not everyone has an equal chance in life. Republicans of the Tea Party standing out on the other side, saying it's not really that big a problem if some have more of an equal chance in life than others. So we go to a more specific question about the distribution of wealth. And this question has really been raised with a big exclamation point by the Occupy Wall Street movement. If there's been anything that I think has percolated to the top, it's been the 99% and the 1%. That mantra is the thing that we've heard from all the various Occupy Wall Street movements. And so this question, I think, gets to the heart of that objection and that concern. We had basically an agree-disagree statement that just said, so society would be better off if the distribution of wealth were more equal. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Among all Americans, 6 in 10 agree with that statement. And when we look among religious groups, what's interesting here is that a majority of every major religious group agrees with this statement. Right, so we still see some big political divides here, with almost 8 in 10 Democrats agreeing with the statement, and less than 4 in 10 of those in the Tea Party or Republicans agreeing with the statement. But despite that sharp political divide, we actually see a near consensus among all major religious groups. This is kind of a rarity in public opinion. You usually see a lot of religious groups falling out along partisan lines. And so this is something actually to kind of pay attention to here, that we have a kind of near consensus among religious groups that accompany a big partisan split. We also see, just going to flag this again for you, the generational differences here. They're really stark. 7 in 10 of millennial generation, those Americans under 30, saying society would be better off if the distribution of wealth were more equal. Less than half, 46% of seniors agreeing with that statement. We'll see similar patterns among some, if we move from kind of ideas and values to specific policies. And here I put up two next to each other, one that really addresses things at the top of the income spectrum, and one that addresses things down at the bottom of the income spectrum among the working poor. So we found really high support. You'll see very similar patterns of support here among these numbers, even though one's about kind of taxing the wealthy, one's about raising the minimum wage for the poor. So the Buffett rule, that is, Americans favor increasing the tax rate on Americans earning more than $1 million a year. 7 in 10 Americans agree with that statement. 85% of Democrats, 7 in 10 independents, even a majority of Republicans, 52%, a slim majority of Republicans agree. Here's also one place I want to flag the Tea Party for you, because here's a place where the Tea Party group actually doesn't look like the rest of Republicans here. So we have a majority of Republicans favoring the Buffett rule, only 40% of the Tea Party saying that they favor taxing those who make over $1 million. The same is true for raising the minimum wage. 2/3 of Americans, and we have a fairly robust question here, raising it from $7.25 to $10 an hour. So it's a pretty robust raise in the minimum wage. Still, 2/3 of Americans support this. We asked this question a year ago, roughly the same support a year ago as we see today. Political differences, again, 8 in 10 Democrats, 2/3 of independents supporting this, and a slim majority of Republicans, and then only a 4 in 10 members of the Tea Party supporting this. And then finally, to kind of take these two things down and look at the generational breaks on these. Interestingly enough, we see more of a generational break among kind of addressing things at the lower end of the economic spectrum, kind of the minimum wage. So there's basically no significant differences between millennials and seniors on taxing Americans who make more than $1 million a year. Basically, 7 and 10 of each support that. But if you look at raising the minimum wage, there's nearly a 20-point gap with nearly 3/4 of millennials saying that they want to raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour. A majority of seniors, but it's only 54%, also support that. So with that, I will stop here, and we will kick off a discussion with Professor Deckman and Professor Casanova. So thank you.
Please come and have a seat. Thank you, Robbie, for presenting those fascinating findings. We have a lot to talk about, and to help us, 2 colleagues, as was mentioned. Jose Casanova from the Berkley Center, a sociologist of religion who's worked on global topics, but also on domestic and comparative issues at the intersection of religion, culture, society, and politics. And Melissa Deckman from Washington College, who'll get us started, who's an expert on gender in American politics, but has written widely also on evangelicals in American politics and related topics. So thank you both for being here. You've each got 8, maybe 10 minutes max to lay out some issues. Then we'll give Robbie a chance to respond and open it up for a wider discussion.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Is this on? I'd like to thank Robbie for inviting me today. I think this is a very interesting survey. So I'd actually like to talk about 2 of the issues put forward in the data that you saw. One concerning the Mormon issue, and then also the income disparity issue at the end, or issues about how Americans feel about the nature of wealth and this whole Occupy Wall Street movement. And I'd like to also predict a little bit ahead to 2012 what these results could mean for Barack Obama and also for the GOP nominee. Also within that, I'd like to focus my attention on 4 groups that, when I read the data several times, kept kind of popping out to me. 4 groups to look out for that I think are going to hold the key for the election in 2012. 2 of those groups are seculars groups, independents, of course, but also that millennial generation. I think that there were some interesting differences with respect to the younger cohort that you saw in a lot of these data points. I think also the 2 most interesting religious groups to keep your eye on are actually mainline Protestants and Catholics, because I think those are really the swing religious voters that you're going to see in 2012, similar to what we saw in 2008. I think also that Barack Obama, there's some potential openings for Obama based on this data that I've seen. I know that I think some data was out last week that showed that no other presidential candidate or an incumbent president had won re-election with such low approval ratings before this. But I think there might be some rays of sunshine for Obama, and of course that depends on who his likely opponent's going to be. All right, so getting back to the first section of the survey, religion, values, and the 2012 election, we still see that Eisenhower's adage is true. It's kind of well-known comment you often hear attributed to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Our form of government makes no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. Right? There's kind of an ad that you can see going on here. Most Americans, 2 and 3, say it's important for a presidential candidate to have strong religious beliefs. And of course, this varies depending on religious tradition. But this is a notion I think that's important to consider that transcends party. For example, in 2007, Pew Forum did a survey that found that voters of both parties gave higher rankings to frontrunners who were running for president in 2007 for both the Democrats and the Republican Party. They gave higher rankings to candidates they thought that had more sincere religious beliefs, regardless of party. So it really does matter. And even though, as Robbie noted in the beginning, we don't have a religious litmus test here in American politics per se, but clearly most Americans like political candidates who have some sort of general civil religious kind of beliefs here. However, I think when Eisenhower said this in the 50s, the presumption for him and for most Americans was that faith meant Christianity. And remember, in the 50s, you had a wide gap between Catholics and Protestants in this country. And not all religious beliefs are alike. And so the data show clearly here from PRRI that Americans express a lot of discomfort with Mormons. 42% acknowledge that. But, you know, they express more discomfort with atheists and Muslims than they do with Mormons. I thought what was interesting, too, in the survey is you often don't hear this discussed in the media, but I think they found like 32% or 32% of Americans expressed discomfort with having an evangelical Christian be president. But that never hurt George W. Bush and other evangelical candidates, and obviously it could be helpful to primary candidates running in the Republican field. But anyway, I also, when I was reading this, thought of a recent book that came out by Robert Putnam and David Campbell called American Grace. They did a big survey in 2007 where they asked people to rank on a feeling thermometer. It's a different way to look at how you support someone in different religious groups in society. And Mormons tended to get rankings that were a little bit lower than other groups. So evangelicals, Black Protestants, seculars would give them an average rating of about 46 out of 100, which is a slightly negative view of Mormons. Whereas mainline Protestants, Catholics, those swing voters I talked about, tended to be a little more positive on Mormons. 51 and 50 was their average ranking. Mormons gave themselves 87 out of 100. So I'm not sure why they couldn't go up to 100, but anyway. Although they tended to like everybody, of course. That's kind of the catch with Mormons. They're all nice people. They even gave atheists higher rankings, higher than 50. So what does all this mean for Romney, Mitt Romney, and for other candidates in the GOP primary? Well, will his faith matter to primary voters? We see clearly here in this data, I've seen in other data sets, that evangelical Christians, they make up a large base of the GOP, and they are more knowledgeable about Romney's faith, and they're more troubled by his faith. And of course, we see the recent comments by Pastor Jeffers and others, whether or not Mormonism is actually a cult. Well, I think Romney is lucky in the sense that if you look at the primary schedule, I pulled it up yesterday just to kind of refresh my brain here. Iowa and South Carolina, evangelical voters play a disproportionate role of the caucus in Iowa and the primary electorate in those states. But he's kind of lucky in the sense that you have New Hampshire, Florida, Nevada, Maine, Minnesota. I think evangelicals are a little bit less of a presence in those states among the primary electorate. So I think that bodes well ultimately for Mitt Romney. And many of the other, I think, states where the Republican Party is more heavily influenced by evangelicals don't really have elections or caucuses until Super Tuesday. And if Romney does really well in those first early contests, I think it could be his to win. I don't think it'll matter as much. I think also going in Romney's favor is that electability at the end of the day and what your positions are on issues matter far more to primary voters than really, I think, religious faith. And I think one thing that was notable in the data that Robbie showed here, I think it's all over for Perry. The fact is that, of course, evangelicals like and admire his religious beliefs, but he's not really viewed as one of them when it comes to a lot of political issues. And I think immigration is the bigger issue there for these primary electorate voters among Republicans than others. So I think that's something to kind of consider. And Kane, I think the reason that Kane has risen so high in the polls, and you probably all would agree with this too, is that he's not Romney. He's someone different. And still, voters are concerned about Romney. He's not necessarily a favorite, but I think that he's viewed as the most electable at the end of the day. Right, so what if Romney gets to the general election? What then happens with respect to the Mormon issue? Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that having a certain religious faith doesn't necessarily ensure defeat at the polls. JFK won in 1960. Some estimates of some voter data, I looked at some older studies, found that he may have lost as many as 1.5 million votes due to Catholicism. But I think it's not going to matter as much for Romney. I think what's more problematic for Romney and his Mormon faith is the issue of age, and the younger cohort. Now, Democrats and Black Protestants aren't comfortable with Romney being a Mormon, but they're not going to vote for a Republican, so that doesn't really matter. So younger voters are very uncomfortable. I think that they were a key to Obama's success in 2008. I think in 2012 they're going to be key to his being reelected. And whether to get those newer voters out and going, I think it's clear that they're probably not going to side with Mitt Romney. Independents, though, this might bode well for Romney if he becomes the GOP nominee. Only 38% expressed being uncomfortable with a Mormon. That's actually lower than the national average. So I think that's actually bodes pretty well for Mitt Romney. Last but not least, in talking about the Mormon issue here, I was really fascinated by that finding about mainline Protestants, in the sense that they were the one group on that list experiment that was done that indicated that they might have some suppressed feelings about a Mormon, being, or not willing to kind of go on the record as saying that they're uncomfortable with Mormons. Now, I'm going to follow the tradition that Stephen Colbert has talked about, the great American tradition of stereotyping groups here. But, and I guess I'm a WASP myself as a white Episcopalian, but I think something about WASPs, they don't like to necessarily say impolite things. And so maybe there's something going on with respect to that. But, with mainliners being up for grabs, potentially, I don't know, this could be an issue for Romney. But mainliners are becoming, I think in 2008, or about 14% or so of the electorate. Catholics are a bigger chunk of the electorate. So we'll have to see how it plays out. I think, though, if Romney is successful in the primary, I think by the general election, it'll fade to be, it won't be as important as an issue. Okay, turning now to the last part of the survey, American values and the economy. I think, of course, the survey clearly shows what other national surveys are showing. Economic issues really matter, and they matter a great deal. And I think, too, it would be interesting to see if that income gap disparity, how much more of an issue it's playing, because their data is from September. And, of course, now we know that more Americans, just last week, New York Times, CBS News poll showed, or 2 weeks ago, 66% of Americans agreed that income and wealth should be distributed more evenly. And I think that's kind of a really pretty interesting statistic, because Americans historically, I think, have been very ambivalent about class issues, if not just they don't like to go there. They don't like to talk about it. So this is really shaping up to be a big difference, or could potentially be a big difference between what Obama's going to run on and what the GOP is going to be running on. I think in terms of religion, what we have to look at here, Catholics, 54% of Catholics saying that not giving everyone an equal chance in life is a major problem. That potentially, I think, could certainly help Barack Obama's chances there. The typical groups you'd expect to support that kind of notion, Black Protestants, Democrats, etc., they tend to be in favor of those sorts of issues, but they're going to vote for Obama anyway. Mainline Protestants, again, one of those groups that is, I think, up for grabs, are more evenly divided on that. And independents are right in the middle, that other big group that both Obama and the GOP nominee are going to have to go after. I think the question here, what the percentage of Americans who say society would be better off if the distribution of wealth was more equal, 61% of Catholics agree with that. I think that, if Obama is successful in turning that into sort of a religious message and talking about sort of how his understanding of his religious faith plays into that, I think there's some openings to kind of bring in some of these voters. Do I think Obama could potentially bring in evangelicals and others? No. He tried in 2008 to I think bring in evangelical voters, and it just didn't work well. I don't think that he's going to have much success there. So, all right. So what can we, the kind of summarizing in terms of that last section here. The one last point I would talk about are millennials and what Robbie was indicating there. I think that this is going to be key. If Obama can bring out millennials, talk about wealth disparity, and I see if Romney becomes the nominee, I think of that over the summer, that famous kind of off-the-cuff remark, corporations are people, my friend. You remember when he said that? I can see that coming in lots of ads. They're going to be playing by the Democrats and groups that support the Democratic Party. So that, I think, is more problematic for Romney, that sort of approach and attitude about the economic issues than his religious faith. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'm glad that the electoral expert went ahead of me. I cannot claim any expertise on electoral politics, so I'll do least on electoral politics and more on the issue of American values from a comparative perspective. The issue, again, the separation paradox, American exceptionalism. No test for office, and yet is one of the most important tests for office. So no official test, and yet it's crucial for most voters. And of course, the opposite then in Europe, where you have relatively establishments, other than in France, or quasi-establishments, and yet this will never be an issue, the religion of the candidate. So this, of course, very, very important, is the Eisenhower statement, religion, I don't care which one. But of course, we do care which one, and here it's interesting, is the majority of Protestants that care about Christianity the way they care about Catholics not being the right religion. Today, the question is whether Mormonism is like Catholicism, a little but much less. I think that the difficulty for Mormons is not today as much as it was for Catholics then. So in this respect, the fact that Catholicism and Judaism have been accepted along with Christianity, we're a Judeo-Christian country, not anymore a Christian that meant Protestant, means that we already accept also Mormons more than we would have done otherwise. The issue of the white mainline, WASP, the establishment, of course, this is in line with what we know, what Andrew Greeley kept saying for decades, the ugly little secret that the establishment was still very much anti-Catholic. All the establishment institutions or universities were anti-Catholic well after, well into the 70s. So you have an element here of this kind of remnant, hidden, ugly secret of the Protestant establishment. I think this is part of the element which is still there. On the other hand, I agree with you that probably it may not be a crucial issue for electability, in the sense that I think there is no other candidate for the Republican Party. And then obviously the question would be, if one thing is for the primaries, the other thing is for the presidential elections. And for the presidential election, I don't think that this will be the issue. It will have been resolved already before, but of course, there is still a lingering issue there that it may come up. The other issue, which is really, really relevant, which is the gap, the growing gap, is not only that people accept the fact that there is inequality, but they accept the fact that equal opportunity is not so relevant. So it's not only, again, this is what using Max Weber used to call the theodicy of good fortune. It's not only that we think that we are lucky to be rich, but we think that we deserve it. And those who are not lucky deserve not to be lucky. This is what basically the correlation between income, those who make more than 100,000% say that equal opportunity is not so important. I mean, this is amazing. This is simply egoism. And of course, it means then, what does it mean for our values? All men are created equal. Of course, we know again from Tocqueville that the whole core of the two modern values are liberty and equality, and there is always a tension between them. Obviously, it's here you have the Tea Party, the Republicans, for which liberty is much more important than equality. The other group for which equality is much more important than liberty. Of course, in this respect, you could say Europeans' equality everywhere, every European country, is much more important than liberty. In this respect, they are more Democrat. So I think that this is a crucial issue, but it shows that, I mean, I would like to see to which extent this is a trend that has been growing, let's say, for the last 20 years. Because obviously, the whole issue of the American dream, the whole ideology has been equal opportunity. If you simply argue that equal opportunity is not that relevant, obviously, I think we are really, really witnessing a radical transformation of an American value. And I would like to see a long trend and how much it is growing. And given the fact that this is happening in the midst of a serious depression, then obviously this is very serious. I mean, the lack of solidarity for the nation, the lack of national solidarity in this country for any non-American is simply unbelievable. I mean, for Europeans, they accept the principle of national solidarity as a given, and it extends itself to education, healthcare. And here, simply, we do not have a concept of national solidarity based on equality and the need to help those who are less fortunate. So this theodicy of good fortune, in which the privileged believe that they deserve to be privileged, this is really a worrying fact. Interestingly, the religious people all across still maintain the notion of equality much than the other. And here we will have to separate. Once you get over 100%, over 100,000 income, whether you will separate then the differences. Who among those that make more than 100,000 still believe that equal opportunity is important? So we will have to really separate here the different groups. Finally, on the electability, what seems interesting for me about the Obama windows of still opportunities, obviously disappointment is really, really the greatest feeling, disappointment. And the problem is that it has no easy solution for Obama. That the disappointment is so much over all kinds of different issues, economy, leadership. So no simple thing that he could remedy. So probably it's there as a very complicated thing because it is all over. If you look at the kind of issues that weaken. On the other hand, the fact that he has so much personal favorability, and especially jobs, the fact that 80% across the board believe that jobs creation is the jobs is the most important issue. And then the majority of people still believe that Obama is better and will be better at creating jobs than the Republicans. Republicans in Congress, of course. Other thing is when it comes to the Republican candidate, whether he's able to prove that he will be able to. So this will be a key issue, to which extent the Republican candidate will be able to present, I assume himself, I don't think that was to be herself, himself as better than Obama of creating jobs. Because ultimately this is going to be the issue, I think.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just add a couple of quick observations before turning it over to Robbie. I think this issue of equality of opportunity is critical, and maybe the wording of the questions is also critical in this respect. And this would be a question for Robbie and the team. The question does not actually reference the phrase equality of opportunity, which is, I think, a value that people across the spectrum would still, at least in the abstract, endorse if that was in the wording of the question. Yeah, equal chances. That's not the way that we think about it in our civil religion, if you will, of equality. So the difference might be that there's a real disagreement about the degree to which that principle is realized in practice. And the existence of a problem might be recognized more on the left than it is on the right, but I think we should separate that out from support for the principle. So that's just something for discussion. And then, yeah, Jose doesn't agree. Good. And then maybe a little bit more on the fascinating findings about generational differences, particularly on the, well, two things that struck me. The Mormon issue. I mean, this huge difference in skepticism of Romney's Mormonism on the part of young people. How do we explain that? I have some ideas, but I'd like to know what the data say. And in addition, on this issue of inequality, that young people should be twice as concerned about inequality as the elderly is also something I would not have expected. So those are two things I wanted to flag for the discussion.
If I may only...
Do you want to let Jose jump in on that?
It was something was not added. In addition to equality, there is an issue of discrimination. And the majority believe that discrimination is still a very serious issue. Majorities across all Americans and all groups, including Tea Party.
What page is that?
It is page 23. Even Tea Party, 58% believe that discrimination against minorities is still a very serious problem, and 58% of Republicans. And yet, they think we've gone too far already. So it's this ambivalence about accepting, but then ultimately, because on the other, you have a very clear relationship between, there is a majority. I mean, Americans, 73% still believe that discrimination against minorities is a very serious problem. And only 40% believe that we've gone too far, which are precisely the Tea Party and the Republican. So here again is something which I see acceptance of not equal opportunity is becoming a serious issue.
So,
well, I'll keep my remarks short, but I do want to respond to a couple of things. Let me start with millennials. They're a really fascinating group, and you know they're very unlikely to be a force in the Republican primaries, but they are. You know, they were a force in 2008, and, you know, with the economy the way it is, and millennials are getting hit pretty hard. They've got a lot of them have college debt, no jobs. You know, we see kind of pessimism. You know, they're heavily involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement. Just a couple of interesting things about this profile, both, as Tom mentioned, on the issue of a Mormon as president, where they have a very surprising profile, and on this inequality stuff. So just a couple of things. On the question about a Mormon as president, millennials are actually express more discomfort than seniors do with a Mormon as president. And that's despite the fact that on most of the other measures of religious minorities, they're more accepting, right? So they're more likely than seniors to accept a Muslim as president. They're more likely than seniors to accept an atheist as president. But they're also more likely to express reservations with a Mormon as president. Let me just say a little bit about what I think is going on there. And this is going to sort of take what we know from the data and from some other studies that we've done and kind of kind of connect the dots. One of the things we know about millennials is that they are more likely to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. They're more likely to be liberal. And they're also more likely to be strongly supportive of rights for gay and lesbian Americans. And I think one of the things going on here, especially with the pushback on a Mormon president, is that what we've heard in focus groups and other stuff is that the millennial generation has associated white evangelical Protestant Christianity and the Mormon church with pushback on rights for gays and lesbians, really around Proposition 8 in California is where it really came to a head. And so I think that's at least one of the factors playing a role here, is that they have that association with Mormons being opposed for rights for gays and lesbians in the country, and they're very strongly supportive. So that's at least one major factor going on there. On the economic inequality front, the other thing to say about this is that the millennial generation is also the most ethnically diverse generation that this country has ever seen, and that is really playing a role as well here.
They don't make $100,000.
That's right. They're not making $100,000. They're very ethnically diverse, and so one of the things that we're seeing is that I think some of the economic debates that I think in generations past have taken place along ethnic lines, right? Latinos and African Americans on one side, white Americans on the other, are actually now starting to be fought along generational lines. And that's because of this different generational makeup. The last numbers I pulled up from the census, we actually got new numbers out analyzing this, that it's 59% of millennial generation are white, and that if you go to seniors, it's 79% are white. So there's a big difference in how white these generations are. And I guess the last thing to say is I do want to emphasize and say we should talk more about this if we have some time, is this liberty and equality. I think these are two fundamental American values, right? And they've always been in tension. We kind of political theorists like wrestling over like how to kind of balance these two values, and if at least if we sort of take it's certainly more complicated than this, but what we could say is that we have the Tea Party sort of favoring one and the Occupy Wall Street movement favoring another, right? And we've got the Tea Party movement majoring on kind of freedom, small government, those kinds of things, maximizing individual freedom. It's also complicated though because they're also social conservatives, right? So it's a little complicated on that side. The Occupy Wall Street movement really talking about equal distribution of wealth and equal opportunity, that's a fundamental argument really about what constitutes a good society and which direction we're going to go, that we could really see in the presidential election being a really a deep-seated debate that is really not about policy minutia but about what the country should be. I mean, this is a really big really big debate. So let me just stop there. We'll make sure we have some time to get questions in.
They asked at least one question about what do you know about the other religion, and there was a fairly high level, I think it was almost 50% for both Muslims and Christians, fairly strong lack of knowledge of the other religion. So I'm wondering what did you ask? Are there data on what people think of when they think of Mormonism, and how do you deal with it in doing this kind of research if you get the sense that their perceptions are not grounded, and I mean perceptions become their own reality, but if they're based on misinformation or absent information, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. This is a great question. I'll start off and see if anybody else wants to jump in. One of the things we do know about from some previous survey work that we've done is that very few Americans, sort of less than half, know someone personally who's Mormon. And this is partially because of the geographic concentration of Mormons in the country, that they're not sort of evenly dispersed around the country. And so what we have is people without a firm firsthand knowledge of knowing someone who's Mormon and seeing that up close and what that relates to. What that typically means is that if there's sort of a silver lining here, say for the Romney campaign, is that, and this is what the I'm a Mormon campaign is all about. If you've seen the kind of public relations campaign that the LDS Church is running, I suppose imamormon.com, is that where it is? You can see it. It's right on the LDS Church homepage. But it's about familiarizing people with, and you could actually go to the website and say, okay, I am an African American, I am 40 years old, and I'd like to see profiles of Mormons who are like me. They actually have a database that they'll pull up, people who fit your personal profile to kind of help you connect with someone who's Mormon who fits basically your demographic. It's pretty fascinating. But that's about this sense that people don't know Mormons in the country. And if there's a silver lining here, it means that those opinions may not be that strongly held, right? And so there may be some openings for, if there is a way of familiarizing, people on a more one-to-one basis, and for Romney, that's going to be on the campaign trail. Right, and so it may depend, for example, on a good ground game to really make a difference.
If I may only add briefly 2 points. One, that from a comparative perspective, the paradox is that outside of the United States, Mormons are the quintessential American religion. Everybody conceives Mormonism as being typically the most typical American religion. And so this is very interesting. And of course, they've been extremely effective in promoting religious freedom as an American value and even using the Religious Freedom Act. So everywhere, Mormons, a lot of people have met Mormons, and they look so American to anybody who is not United States. So they are the quintessential American. This is one of the paradoxes. And the prejudice, stereotype, the question is a stereotype based on lack of information or on the wrong information. Is it a stereotype because it's an exotic, unknown religion, not our religion, or is it because we know enough of this religion and we don't like it? And this is the question of the millennial. We don't know whether it is which of the two things is it.
I would add, too, to that. If you look historically, a lot of what you see that some evangelical leaders are saying about Mormonism being a cult, etc., similar things were said 20, 30 years ago about Catholics. Similar things were said about Jews prior to that. So I think it's just, as we become more familiar and we see leaders in those positions, I think over time I think it'll become less of an issue. There are theological differences, but I think it helps Mitt Romney, for example. I remember in 2008 or 2007, late 2007, Jim Dobson, head of the Focus on the Family, essentially said, look, he's a good moral person. He didn't really want to go and talk about theology because theology is too divisive. I think it's telling that Pat Robertson, and talking about Perry trying to bring up the birther campaign again, and some evangelicals trying to bring up Mormonism again. Pat Robertson said, look, we got to stop talking about this stuff. It's too divisive. We just need to focus more on our similarities. And so when notable conservative evangelicals are saying that, I think it's going to maybe lead to some more acceptance over time. But I think you're absolutely right. It's about familiarity. And I think that the more that people meet other Mormons and get familiar with the I Am a Mormon campaign, it's pretty good. It's a really good campaign. I think it'll dissipate over time.
We've got a lot of hands, so let's collect 3 questions. Tom Reese in front here first.
Tom Reese, Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown. For Robbie, on page 5 and 6, you examine whether different groups and how they're uncomfortable with Muslim, Mormon, or atheistic president. Did you ask about Catholics? Is it gone or is it? I mean, Pastor Jeffries thinks Catholicism is a cult created by Satan, and there are many evangelicals who don't think Catholics are Christians, let alone Mormons. So I was wondering about that. And then secondly, page 11 to 12, you look at the candidates' favorability among various groups. Again, what about Catholics? If we look at the Republican primaries in 2008, it's quite clear that McCain overwhelmingly got the Catholic vote in those primaries and was very important for his election. And they didn't go for Huckabee or evangelicals candidates. So I'm wondering what is the Catholic, what Catholic Republicans' attitudes are towards these various candidates.
Okay, we'll take 2 more in the front row here. Nick?
Nick Simontelli from Faith and Public Life. One question on, Jose, your comment about Mormons being the new Catholics. Melissa, you also talked about it. Do you think that there's a distinction, though, a racial or ethnic distinction that previously when anti-Catholicism was at its height, Catholics were viewed as non-whites, whereas Mormons are viewed as whites? And secondly, to kind of weigh in maybe on the Jose-Tom disagreement about the equal opportunity question, I think I agree with Professor Banshoff that not asking that, probably that exact phrase has exacerbated the differences, but do you think that maybe not asking that phrase, which is something of a recognizable political talking point, got to the heart of the matter more? Do we think that if we said economic opportunity or equal opportunity, we would have heard Republicans and conservatives say, of course I agree with that, but when you ask it in a different way, you get maybe different, more true feelings, and it's hard to say true in this case, but yeah.
The heart of the matter, yeah. One more, and then we'll get some responses.
I'm Jacob Lupfer. I'm a PhD student in political science here at Georgetown. So I was interested towards the end of the survey with some of the questions on economic and social inequality, and then this general thing. It's interesting in these kind of, I go to a lot of these type of events, so we've pretty much like institutionalized Tea Party as a category.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of wondering, first of all, like, what does that mean? Does that mean, I went to a rally or I agree with their goals or something like that? And then I guess I was just kind of curious, what you make of, so in a lot of this stuff, Tea Party is indistinguishable from the broader Republican category, but then in other things, they're more likely to say that fewer people are insured because of the health insurance law and stuff like that. So, I'm just kind of wondering, is this something that Republican presidential candidate will have to run towards or run away from, or is this a movement that's succeeded in educating its people? That, nearly half of them still want the Buffett rule and still want to, raise the minimum wage, which seems kind of like pretty far from the stuff I've heard from the rallies. So, I was just kind of wondering, is this something that are we still going to be talking about this time next year, or basically just some thoughts on that?
Yeah. All right, let me jump in from the last and go forward. So the Tea Party movement, it's a great question. We actually, a year ago, did a lot of work in trying to figure out exactly, there's different ways to ask about it. If you ask, are you a member of the Tea Party movement, you get smaller percentages. If you ask, do you sympathize with the kind of stance of the Tea Party, you get much bigger. Our question is somewhere calibrated sort of in the middle. It's, do you consider yourself a part of the Tea Party movement is how we ask the question, yes or no. We've asked this question all year long. We get somewhere between 10 to 15%, somewhere in that range of Americans saying that they identify with the Tea Party movement. It fluctuates a little bit. It's been pretty consistent right around those numbers. They are, overwhelmingly, so 8 and 10 of them say they voted Republican in the last presidential election. They're largely a Republican kind of subset with some kind of independents tacked on. What we know about them is half of them also, nearly half, 47% of them, say they're also part of the Christian right movement. So they borrow heavily from the Christian right movement as well. And what we see, I think, one of the ways we've kind of described this in the past, and I think you see it there on things like the minimum wage, the Buffett rule, where you even have a majority of Republicans there. We also see this on immigration. There's some gaps between Republicans overall and the Tea Party movement, and we see it on health care, as you mentioned. So what I think has held the Tea Party together, that subset of Republicans really together, is antipathy for President Obama. They're very low favorability, much lower than Republicans. They are very strong and want to repeal the health care law against that, and that's not something that's high on the agenda of most other Republicans. And they tend to have views on immigration that are really about deportation rather than kind of a path to citizenship at much higher rates than other Republicans. So there's a kind of a few issues that kind of stitch them together. But on other stuff, they look, as you mentioned, right in line with the rest of Republicans. One way we describe this is there is that kind of compassionate conservatism that President Bush sort of embodied, and the Tea Party has perhaps cut some of the compassionate edge off of compassionate conservatism, right? And on some of these issues is maybe one way to think about it in the upcoming electorate. Now, whether they're going to be a force, they're certainly not the force they were, 2 years ago. I mean, there's not a candidate that is their candidate that's out there as the front runner. They're sort of divided among the kind of front runners right now. That may change in the future, but right now they're not the driving force really in the electorate.
But I think they're the driving force right now in the GOP. If you look at actions of Congress, because
that's true. Congressional races,
the congressional Republicans are doing are very much opposed to what most Americans want. Even Republicans and evangelicals we see here. So that's an interesting dynamic, and how that plays out in 2012, I think it's yet to be determined. I think for Tea Party activists, what they care about is small government. Their emphasis is going to be on the government spending. Their solutions to creating jobs is let the private sector flourish. So we need to roll back government. And so, I think a Republican nominee, whoever it's going to be, is going to have to kind of weigh, how much of that activism and, that excitement that the Tea Party brings me, how much is that going to weigh against those middle voters that, that general election candidates often seek to go after. So it's going to be a tension there, I think.
Let me go to Tom's question. Good to see you, Tom. We did not ask about Catholics, and your question, is it gone? It may not be completely gone, but when we have asked in other surveys like feeling thermometers about Catholics, the country on like the 0 to 100 thing in the last survey. That's right. That Professor Casanova was with us at the Brookings Institution. And, they're exceptionally high favorability ratings for Catholics in the country. And Catholics, Jews, African Americans were all, they were really, really high. So we didn't actually ask about it in this survey, but we do know that those numbers are actually quite high. On favorability of the candidates, so here's just a few. The one I don't have right in front of me is Kane, but among Catholics, 46% have a favorable view of Romney, 31% PRRI, 55% Obama. So Obama's favorability among Catholics is actually still higher than the other Republican candidates. I can get you Kane after this. I just don't have it on the page in front of me. So.
There was
Yes, the ethnic distinction is crucial because obviously Catholics, you have theological anti-Catholicism and socio-economic racial anti-Catholicism. That's why you have the whole literature, how the Irish became white. So in this respect, and that's why I said that the Mormons are the quintessential Americans from this perspective. But the question is how much theological anti-Mormonism is there. So I think it's very little socio-economic anti-Mormonism, but theological may be an issue. And the chance versus opportunity, I use precisely the vocabulary of Max Weber. He uses the word chance in the sense of theodicy, fate, destiny, providence, and the justice of God giving people more privilege or less, and the theodicy of good fortune, that people that have good fortune believe that they deserve it. And so this is the respect in which I see that people that have good fortune actually believe that they deserve it. And this is what really bothers me. Of course, if you ask equal opportunity, then it may be loaded, maybe much more difficult, the same thing that with discrimination.
Just a word on that. I think when people understand the distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of results. That's the ideological divide. Chance. I know the word chance, I think, fudges it a little bit. That's all, because people can interpret into that word one or the other of the more familiar frames that they might use. But anyway, that's a small point.
To that, I don't think it is such a small point. I heard a story on NPR yesterday afternoon that was pretty telling, getting back to millennials and their attitudes about equal opportunity. I think for the first time, one survey that came out, and I don't remember the source, is saying that younger people, for the first time, believe that they will not have as good a life as their parents, right? This American idea of social mobility. That is a problem. That is a potential sea change, and that's what's really I think most Americans say, no, we shouldn't have a system where everyone's equal. We believe in liberty, but we've always held the impression, vast majority of Americans, that there is social mobility. If you work hard enough, we'll get ahead. And I think that the income gap has been growing the last couple of decades, but only in the last couple of years, with the recession, with 9% unemployment, are people really seeing this kind of income disparity in a new light. So I think it's the potential to really shape the nature of the next election.
The third question in front, did you address that?
Yes. Got it. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's gather some more. We'll start in the back with you over there.
Hi, I'm Laura Ann Hughes with the Faith and Politics Institute, and I am the State's Outreach Fellow. I was wondering if any in the panel had any suggestions on how we can improve religious dialogue, and a lot of what my organization does is try to hold panels improve dialogue between Congress and their district and the general public. So how do we help change some of these problems that you were discussing?
Stay in the back over here, and we'll move forward. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Sean Winters from National Catholic Reporter. We all use the Dwight Eisenhower quote because it captures that civic religion thing. But he actually went on in the same speech to say, provided those religions ground and put forth an idea about human equality. And so when I look at the survey numbers on page 22, and a majority of all the religious groups actually do identify with the idea that society should be more equal. And then I look at the millennials who, from other surveys, seem to go to church less. Where are they getting their commitment to equality, if not from Catholic social teaching, if not from kind of scriptural impulses. And if you haven't asked that, I would really, really hope some questions, try to get to the bottom of that.
Here in the third row, right here.
Good morning. My name is Ben Abdul Haq, Islamic Consultants of America and Masjid Muhammad. This question is mainly for Professor Casanova. In your opening statement, you mentioned that of the disappointment with President Obama, and then you mentioned on the second half of the statement regarding the challenges he faced. I wanted to get a understanding if this is a contradictory statement or a contradistinctive statement, and what did you really expect from President Obama before he became president? Because people always talk about disappointments. For those of us who are African American and Muslim, I'm also a Muslim, we didn't expect much change. We knew as the first non-white president, not the first black president, as the first non-white president, it was not going to be a cakewalk. Too many people were not realistic. And with the challenges he faced, he was faced with a multitude of problems. He's not a magic man. And so when you use the term disappointment, for us, that's a loaded term.
Maybe there was one more question right behind you, right there. Yeah.
Hi there, Mika Reeser. I actually worked with Robert at People for the American Way a few years ago. I was curious, on page 19, the chart there, talking about the salience of political issues, and I found it interesting that for the last three categories, the rightmost three, you had almost identical proportion of Republicans agreeing that those were critical issues, and I was curious if that was just in survey work you wind up with coincidences, or if you guys had looked to see was there any commonality that tied those groups, the people who are answering those three, to sort of make them stand out so much from the majority of Republicans, if that was a overlapping group of people who are answering those three, or if it was just random chance.
Okay, let's go back to the panel. Robbie?
Okay. Thanks, Mika, for that. I haven't actually looked to see if those are the same people, but I think what's kind of, if we only had the I'm on page 19, if we only had the Republican bar for which things are critical issues up there and didn't have any of the other bars, the pattern that would be really clear is that what Republicans care about is, number one, creating jobs, number two, reducing the deficit, and right there after it, not about 10 points down, but still 6 and 10, protecting Social Security. And after that, none of the other things really have much teeth among Republicans. I think that's probably the most important lesson there, is that it falls off pretty sharply after that. On the disappointing question, I know this is for Professor Casanova, but let me just jump in and offer a little bit of perspective here. I mean, what you say about your own experience is actually borne out pretty well in the data. So if I look at among African Americans, for example, how they answered this question about what they felt about the Obama presidency, 61% satisfied, 12% excited, 8% disappointed. Right, and then 16% worried, 2% angry. Right, so I mean it's very 61% satisfied. I mean that's really strong, and another 12% excited. Yeah, and Hispanics are fairly high as well. The 34% satisfied, 9% excited, so almost half either satisfied or excited. 25% disappointed though among Hispanics, so bigger. But you're right, among African Americans, I mean that's in single digits. The disappointed front is in single digits there. And then Michael Sean, thanks for that very insightful question. Let me affirm that you're right, that millennials are attending religious services at much lower rates than any generation previous. They are certainly less formally affiliated. They're more likely to just say none of the above when you kind of give them, a list of kind of things to identify with. We have our research director in the front row here who's done a lot of work on millennials and is not quite a millennial himself, but close. So I'm going to actually turn this one over to him and let him answer the question about where are millennials getting their impulses. The one thing I'll say is that they certainly are not irreligious. Just because they're not formally religiously affiliated with an institution doesn't mean they don't have any kind of spiritual impulses. But let me let Dan take that one.
Thanks. It's a really excellent question. Young people overall don't tend to be much less affiliated politically, religiously. In fact, most of them are independents. So where are they getting their values from? Well, they do say that they're spiritual, they're connected, to communities. So I think a lot of it probably comes from just their sort of connection to each other through the technology, through the their Facebook, through their friends, through their family. And I think actually we should really be looking at families. Really, I think more millennials are now living at home with parents than any other generation when they were the same age. So they're much tighter with their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. They definitely report that they have they communicate more frequently with parents and siblings. So I think they have a really strong sense of family, and I think that is one area where I would really try to look and seeing where millennials get their values from.
Yeah, and the other thing we've seen is just the idea of fairness. With the millennial generation is a pretty fundamental value, that fairness cuts across a whole lot of things. And certainly when we talk about economic inequality, this kind of commitment to fairness rings pretty loudly.
Can I address the first question about changing the dialogue back there, which I thought was an interesting question? I think there are attempts out there for people within religious organizations who have deep theological differences to try to bridge gaps and to talk about commonality. A friend of mine, Amy Sullivan, writes about religion for Time magazine. She, in fact, last week brokered a talk between Jim Wallace of Sojourners, a kind of a liberal, progressive organization, Richard Land, head of the Southern Baptist Convention's lobbying arm, and they had a really interesting conversation about dealing with reducing abortion, dealing with poverty issues in a way that, that got some press, but it's not making headline news, Or I think of the efforts of Richard Cizik, who used to be involved with the National Evangelical Association. He actually left because he was developing more liberal views on environmental issues and so he had a kind of a falling out, but he started a new organization, and the name of which escapes me. But if you go to the website,
it's a new evangelical partnership for the common good.
Evangelical partnership. But if you read it, he's talking about having a greater dialogue with Muslim Americans and Islam more generally, using language that I also hear about that with the evangelicals in reaching out to Catholics and Jews several generations ago. He's incorporating that language, talking about the commonalities between Islam as an Abrahamic faith, which is pretty new stuff. And so there are, I think, definitely attempts out there to try to change the dialogue, to talk about commonalities. But, they're fighting the news media, which is more fixated on our differences than our similarities, fighting, to compete with space, dealing with Herman Cain's sexual escapades and Kim Kardashian's failed marriage. So Americans have very short attention spans. They want to talk about other things. There are efforts out there, but getting them out to the public, it's a challenge.
And the increasing inequality, I would simply, the millennial values. Obviously, I think the self-evident truths are becoming more taken for granted than ever. The truths of equality, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So this is simply a general trend, which is not only a much more confirmed American trend, but a global trend. So that's why it's the more interesting the fact that as your income grows, this value weakens. This is what I was trying to, although it is fairness, is a much more taken for granted value, generalized value today. Nonetheless, it decreases when inequality increases. This is the point I was trying to make. Second, concerning disappointment, I fully agree with you. I was only inconsistent in the following sense. Disappointment, it has two different dynamics. One, economic, and you could say there is nothing he could do, the cards he was given. Second, leadership. And the point is there are so many different reasons for grounds for disappointment that the point I make is no single thing that Obama could do would remedy this disappointment. So it's very widespread disappointment. On the other hand, the options come precisely because economically, still, most people believe that he can do better for job creation than others. And so we don't know. We don't know what the chances are. I think they're still quite good chances. And the interreligious dialogue, I think that, yes, this in our own center, interfaith religious dialogue is a central component of what we do here at the Berkley Center. I think that at the ground level in the United States, there's a lot of work being done on interreligious dialogue. You go through cities, maybe not where you have more homogeneous religious communities in the South, but in the cities across the country, there is a lot of interreligious dialogue going on the ground. So more needs to be done, but I think that it is a question of the public opinion in terms of how those issues
Make one quick comment. Just one quick comment on that first question, too, that I almost forgot to make is, you know, on many issues that we look at, what we see is that partisanship runs right through religious affiliation, right? So that people in certain religious groups fall out the way that their political affinity would predict that they would. What's interesting to me on this question of, for example, the distribution of wealth being more equal, what's interesting to me on that question is that we actually have all major religious groups, including white evangelical Protestants, who are overwhelmingly Republican, saying society would be better off if the distribution of wealth were more equal, when only 35% of Republicans agree with that statement. So if you're looking for a place where religious dialogue can maybe make a difference in the country, I think when you find an issue like that, especially a fundamental one, like that would be a great place to start, where a kind of interreligious dialogue might actually find a way to kind of, you know, bridge some of the political polarization in the country.
And I can't resist making a quick plug for a project that we're doing with Ford called the Dialogue on American Values. We had a first event in Philadelphia that George Stephanopoulos hosted. It's available online, trying to change the discourse, trying to model a discourse open to different religious and philosophical points of view, centered on values. It's difficult work, especially in an election year, but we're trying. We've just got a couple minutes, but I want to take maybe two more questions from the audience before we wrap up. Let's see, people we haven't heard from in the back, and then up front, David. Yeah.
My name is Peter Lawson. I'm an Army chaplain, Army War College fellow. I was curious about what are the criteria you're using to define evangelical?
Okay. Let's see, David. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. David Berkley, a PhD candidate here in the government department at Georgetown. I was curious, so the numbers on anti-Mormon discomfort among white evangelicals obviously include both Republicans, but also some independents and even a few Democrats. So I was curious, Robbie, if you knew when you actually slice out the independent, if you just look at the GOP white evangelicals, does that number go up or down, or does it not make a difference? Because particularly for the primary, it seems to me that's important.
Okay, Robbie, you got the last word.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, David, that one will be easy now, and I can get it to you later. The answer is I don't have that number in front of me. What we do know, though, is that evangelicals vote for Republican candidates about 8 and 10. So those numbers, it won't be much if we slice out Democrats and independents, especially if we look at not just affiliation but voting patterns. So it shouldn't move the needle much, but we can check and I'll let you know, given the overwhelming numbers. The other question is a great question. It's always good to be clear about these things, about how we define evangelicals. We define them the way that most social scientists define them, and it's the same as the Pew Forum and other places do. And basically, we have a battery of questions, and so the criteria are for white evangelical Protestants, which is the group that we have been talking about most today. It's you identify as white, you identify as Protestant, and then the big break question is whether you identify as a born-again or evangelical Christian. So if you say yes to that question and you're white and Protestant, you get classified as an evangelical. If you say no to that question and you're white and Protestant, you get classified as a mainline Protestant. That's the basic break.
All right, well, thank you. We've come to the end of our formal program. I again want to thank Robbie and his team for launching their tremendous report here. I'm sure there'll be a great press echo in the coming days. I want to thank our panelists and ask you to thank all of us up here for putting together this great program. I also wanted to mention on the way out, if you're interested, we have some more information about the dialogue that we're working on with Ford around American values and some of our online resources that track the religious rhetoric of presidential candidates.